Oh, let's get into some more serious stuff.
Shortly after the Maidan change of power in Ukraine, the Maidan coup, as the Russians always now speak about it. And by the way, just to make it clear, in my opinion, it was also. In my opinion, also.
It was a coup. I mean, they murdered innocent protesters, the people that took power. They weren't the good guys.
It was a coup. But anyway, an event that took place 12 years ago, shortly after those events, and that is the fire that took place in the trade union building in Odessa, when protesters against the new government.
It was horrible. I remember watching the video. I would play it now, but it's just burning on a building on fire and people screaming and some people jumping out second story on fire. Yeah, no, it was terrible.
The mob mentality of several thousand football fans and pro-Maidan activists bussed in throughout Ukraine was the fuel. The spark? Right sector agitators with a devious agenda. Together they marched on the Odessa Trade Union building, a last refuge to which the vastly outnumbered several hundred anti-Maidan activists camped outside fled to mount their final defense. Despite their efforts, pro-Maidan forces armed with improvised weapons and Molotov cocktails surrounded the building, and up in flames it went. People jumped out of windows to escape the excruciating death that awaited them in the inferno. Those who tried to leave through the first floor exits were severely beaten by neo-Nazis and pro-Maidan cohorts outside. By the time the police intervened, between 40 and 50 people were killed in the massacre. All of them resisted the neo-fascist-backed Euromaidan government.
Regime that had
I think like 50 people died.
Established itself in Kiev,
burned alive.
In Odessa, basically withdrew into a trade union building in Odessa, which was then set on fire. Now, this is a ghastly affair, one which has never attracted in the West the attention that it deserves. But
the fact that Ukraine never prosecuted, never put anyone in jail for that, it just shows you that the current government in Kiev is utterly corrupt.
One which played a role in shaping Russian opinion of the whole crisis in Ukraine. And when I mean Russian opinion, I mean Russian public opinion of the crisis in Ukraine, which simply cannot be overstated. Firstly, this event took place in Odessa, a city of enormous emotional significance to the Russians, as a major historic city built by Catherine the Great, a city that has played a pivotal role in Russian culture and Russian history, a city which is considered a hero city because of the way it was defended and defended itself during the Second World War. That already would have ensured that an event in Odessa would have attracted a huge amount of attention across Russia. Another factor, I have no doubt, is the fact that this incident took place between two critically important holidays. The 1st of May, which continues to be celebrated as a holiday in Russia, and the 9th of May, which is the day when the Russians celebrate their country's victory over Germany in the Second World War. And of course, not just victory over Germany, the country, but over the ideology that Germany had adopted during the Second World War, and which because of the sensitivities on this platform, I have to be very careful in talking about. But that ideology, which for the Russians, it was a central part of the Second World War for the Russian people to fight against. And the third factor was the gruesome nature.
It was gruesome.
The deaths of many people.
Imagine if some group set 50 Americans on fire and trapped them in the building and let them burn to death. Would we are mad at Iran just for taking like 50 hostages, which they eventually released. Imagine how angry we'd be if towards a country who actually burned 50 of our citizens alive.
Protesters, who of course were protesters, who identified themselves with Russia and with Russian culture, and the fact that they were attacked and that the fire is universally believed in Russia to have been started by
It was obviously started by Ukraine, and they trapped them in the building. Then they set all of the entrances on fire. It was murder.
Ukrainian activists who not only were vehemently hostile to Russia, but who, to the Russian mind, in Russian belief, and actually
They are the N-word. He's afraid to say it on YouTube. Maybe I should be afraid too, but no, Nazis. They're Nazis.
in reality, in many cases, support or continue that ideology that held power in Germany in the 1940s, which the Russians defeated in the Second World War. So all of this was a shock, and it was a transformative event. After what happened in the Odessa fire, it became impossible, in my opinion, for Russia and Ukraine, the new Ukraine, to establish normal relations. It was something that, even if there had been a desire to do it in the Kremlin,
It wasn't just those 50 people. All across the country, anyone who was in any way seen as sympathetic towards Russia, and you were a politician, you were either murdered or you were forced to flee. And then they held elections, and surprisingly, there were no candidates that were sympathetic towards Russia at all. The wonders of democracy.
Kremlin would have gone so much against the tide of opinion.
In a country where 2/3 of the people speak Russian, consider themselves Russians, they elected a government where no one was sympathetic towards Russia, and everyone hated Russia. Very democratic.
Russia itself, that it would have been all but impossible. Well, the Russians have repeatedly, over the years, spoken up about the Odessa fire. Putin himself has done so. But the Foreign Ministry has now released a statement about the Odessa fire, and it says that Ukraine has repeatedly broken its promise to identify and bring the perpetrators of that fire to justice. By the way, that is basically true. There's been minimal attempt by the Ukrainian authorities to investigate or prosecute this incident. And that the justice...
50 people burned alive and no attempt to investigate at all. That's a Nazi terrorist regime in Kiev.
For the victims of that fire will be achieved when the objectives of the special military operation are achieved. Now that, it seems to me, is an exceptionally important statement, because what it effectively says is that an event that took place in Odessa will only be treated justly, will only receive justice as a result of Russia's achievement of its political and military goal.
In other words, so far the war in Ukraine, area that Russia controls, right here, here's Odessa. Now, Odessa is important for two reasons. One, it's not in current fighting mode. To get Odessa, Russia would have to conquer a huge amount of Ukraine. And I think they're going to be close to capturing Odessa by the end of this year. I think it's going to snowball. But that's probably the point. But the other important thing is Odessa is Ukraine's one port that they have left. They lose Odessa, they no longer have access to the sea. They can no longer export grain via the sea. Ukraine becomes a landlocked country. And it becomes a joke of a country. So Ukraine had an opportunity to sell this and only lose the part that's Russia has already taken. But they instead decided not to do that. And so now they're going to lose probably half the country. Probably all this. The Ukraine will be this part over here.
In the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. In other words, the goal of the special military operation now extends to bringing to justice an event, those responsible for an event that took place in Odessa.
And they can only bring people who committed this burning of 50 people in a building in Odessa if they capture Odessa. So Russia just basically announced its intention to take Odessa. It's huge.
Itself. And on that, I noticed something further as well, which is that in a meeting with military officials that the Russian commander of the Russian forces in the area of the special military operation undertook a meeting, a photograph of this meeting, the commander, of course, being General Gerasimov. Behind Gerasimov, there was a map which showed all of southeastern Ukraine under Russian control, including Odessa itself. Well, it seems.
Yep. So that's now officially the goal of Russia. All of this. They want to take this up here so that it's harder for them to send drones in. They want a buffer zone, so they're going to take that and then all the way down here. So whether they decide to take Kiev or not, that depends on how events play out. But now I think this is the area they originally want. These 1, 2, 3, 4 oblasts. And they have pretty much already achieved that. I mean, see, there's just a tiny little sliver right here. They still need to conquer. I mean, they basically have they've accomplished that goal. And now they're going to start moving further.
All right, Alexander, let's talk about what is happening with Project Ukraine. What is going on with the 90 billion gift that they are going to be receiving from Europe any day now. We have the fast track of Ukraine into the European Union, which has hit a stumbling block. But Zelensky is pushing hard for the EU to accept Ukraine by 2027, 2028. Many EU member states are not so hot on the idea. And then, of course, we can talk very briefly about what is happening.
Ukraine will never be part of the EU. That was a pipe dream that was sold to them.
On the front line, if you like, and go over that a little bit. Anyway, let's start off, I guess, with the diplomacy and the money and all that stuff. Or do you want to go to the front line?
No, let's talk first about the loan, because you're absolutely correct. They've now got this 90 billion euro loan. And as you've, I think, mentioned on X, it's increasingly looking as if 20 billion euros of it is going to come from Germany, and it's going to go directly from Germany to Ukraine, which looks like the Germans are cutting out completely all questions of going to the bond markets, financial markets, and things of this kind. My increasing
Germans are just giving $20 billion to Ukraine. No strings attached, money that will never be repaid. Aren't the Germans generous? Stupid too, but whatever.
That this is going to be a direct financial transfer from Germany to Ukraine. Bear in mind, Ukraine's only in line to get 30 billion euros anyway. If the Germans give Ukraine 20 billion euros, that's 2/3 of Ukraine's actual allocation from the loan. And it's not a loan because Ukraine will never pay it back.
Yep.
Russians will never pay reparations.
Obviously.
Merz, determined to keep Project Ukraine going, obsessed with conflict with Russia, is going to give Ukraine, or so it looks to me, 20 billion euros dressed up as a loan. I have to say this, it's looking to me like a confidence trick played on the German people. That's how this whole thing is starting to shape out. And
$20 billion isn't a small amount to just be handing out willy-nilly.
Given the kind of obsession that Merz has, that should not surprise us. I don't know whether you have a different view, but that at the moment is mine.
No different view. Germany is on the hook. We'll get into Germany in a different video.
Yeah.
But they're already implementing austerity.
Yeah.
Austerity measures, while at the same time...
Austerity measures, cutting back services for their people, while giving Ukraine 20 billion.
Going to be giving tens of billions of euros to Zelensky, which is just money disappeared.
Yes.
Or at least a part of that money is going to go to the MIC, which is Mertz's pet project, is to build up the military, to give contracts to military companies.
Yes. I mean, dare I say it, this is what you'd expect from Mr. BlackRock, the kind of chancellor that he is. But I'm going to say something else. I think it's the sort of accounting trick, and this is a very shabby accounting trick that can only really be played once. I think the mood in Germany, and I'm in touch with people in Germany, I think the mood in Germany is hardening, and I don't think they'll be able to pull this one off a second time. That's my view. Obviously, there is an enormous momentum even within Germany, to keep this whole thing on the road and going. But that's my sense. As you said, we were going to talk about Germany in another program. Suffice to say that it does look as if Zelensky, over the next couple of weeks, is indeed going to get a lot of money, though nowhere near as much as he wants. And as we discussed in a previous program, he's coming back for 19 billion euros more. Because with Zelensky, however much you give him, it is never enough. Now, the other big thing that's happening is that we've now reached that point where the European Union is being asked by Ukraine, by
This is the interesting part.
Zelensky, to fulfill its promise. The Ukrainians are now banging on the door and they're asking for EU membership. And they want EU membership now. And this is absolutely crucial because this entire conflict, this whole crisis began
Yes.
not because of Ukraine's desire to enter NATO. If you go back, say, to 2008, when the idea
It was called Euromaidan for a reason. It was all about joining the EU. That's the reason they overthrew the pro-Russia president that wanted to stay in a trade union with Russia. By the way, the 2/3 of Ukraine's foreign trade was with Russia. And the Euromaidan protesters wanted to cut a deal with the EU that would require ending trade with Russia, basically, to get it out of the trade union with Russia. When this is for a country that 2/3 of their goods go to Russia, this would have been an absolute disaster. And oh my God, Ukraine has been a train wreck ever since Euromaidan.
of Ukraine joining NATO was floated at the Budapest summit meeting, the NATO summit meeting in Budapest. Most Ukrainians, the vast majority of Ukrainians at that time, were not interested in joining NATO. What they were interested in, what they were constantly told, what they were endlessly promised was EU entry. And as I remember, and of course,
It's now 12 years later, and still no progress at all on that. They were sold a pipe dream.
as you remember, this whole crisis, the original Maidan crisis, began in 2013 over an association agreement between the EU and Ukraine, whereby Ukraine agreed ultimately to join the EU single market and to put its entire economy on a footing where it was abiding by EU regulations, the famous acquis, the system of laws that the European Union has. And this was absolutely seen and understood by people in Ukraine to be a pathway and a promise to eventual EU membership. And the whole issue, what gave the whole protest movement in 2013, 2014 traction, which led to the collapse of the Yanukovych government, the arrival in power of the regime, which basically is still there today, was this issue of joining the EU. In fact, the Maidan protests at the time were called Euro Maidan.
They
And there
were?
were flags of the EU all over the place, all over Maidan Square. And as I'm sure you remember, I think you saw them, more of them than I did. There were all sorts of films being produced by the EU about the glittering life that Ukrainians would have if Ukraine did join the E EU.
And look where the Ukraine is now. Losing half their country, and the rest, the infrastructure is completely destroyed, and no hope of EU membership. Ukraine got fucked so hard.
And all of this. Well, I think what is now becoming clear is that as Ukraine demands EU entry, there is actually significant, perhaps overwhelming pushback from the member states, the existing member states, against EU membership from Ukraine. That is coming even from people like Merz. And I think what is becoming now impossible to deny is that the promise of EU membership that was extended to Ukraine back in the 2000s and especially in 2013 was never
For which hundreds of thousands of men have died in this because of this Euromaidan coup. And it was all for a sham.
intended sincerely. It was always a bait to create trouble between Ukraine and Russia. And it was intended basically to destroy the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. And that at this particular time, today, in other words, the priority for the EU is not to get Ukraine into the European Union, it is to continue the war in Ukraine with Russia.
Yeah, some in Europe aren't being coy about it anymore. They're just saying we need to keep supporting Ukraine to weaken Russia, and by the time Ukraine falls, Russia will be weaker, and then we can fight them. And they're basically completely sacrificing Ukraine, knowing they're going to lose. And the only reason for supporting Ukraine, according to those people, is to hurt Russia, and they already given up as Ukraine as a lost cause.
To prevent the Ukrainians from coming to terms with the Russians. And that is all that they are interested in where Ukraine is concerned.
If a year ago, during first negotiations Trump tried to do, if an agreement had been reached, this is all Ukraine would have lost. Everything past this, everything that Ukraine loses this year, because Russia is advancing. It's not only advancing here, it's opened up new fronts up here. If you go back a month, it's still the spring where the ground is muddy, so the progress right now isn't as great. But just you wait. Starting this month, it's going to start moving really fast.
Just as the 90 billion euro loan is turning to be a confidence trick on the German people, so the prospect of EU membership is a confidence trick on the Ukrainian people. And for some people in Ukraine, perhaps they might start to ask themselves at this point, what was it all for in the end? What was
It is for nothing. Your country got wrecked. A generation of your men got killed, all for nothing, because you were stupid enough to believe fake EU promises.
all this nightmare that Ukraine has gone through over the last 10 plus years? What ultimately was it all for? If, as is starting to look possible, Ukraine is not going to become a member of the EU soon, and if it does not become a member of the EU soon, that means it will never become a member of the EU ever.
Well, we've been saying for a while now that it's ridiculous to incorporate Ukraine into the European Union, even if you didn't have all the issues with Russia, the conflict, even if you didn't have Maidan. Ukraine was simply not ready to join the EU. If you go by the EU's requirements, Ukraine would need, from 2014, Ukraine would have needed 30, 40 years to get its economy, its fiscal policy, its judicial, all of that stuff in line with the requirements to enter the EU. But the EU no longer admits based on those requirements, really. It's more of, as you've said many times, a geopolitical project. So the number one requirement now to enter the EU is, do you hate Russia?
Yes.
Do you want conflict with Russia? It doesn't mean you're going to get into the EU, but they'll dangle that carrot in front of you as long as you fulfill that requirement. So Ukraine says, yes, we despise Russia. We'll go to war with Russia. Will we get into the EU? Well, here's the carrot. We'll dangle in front of you, but just keep on fighting. Moldova, the same, right? They do the same thing. Moldova.
Serbia, the same, by the way.
Yeah, but Serbia doesn't want to fight Russia.
No, I know. They say all the time to people in Serbia, if you want to join the EU, you're absolutely
You have to hate
welcome.
Russia.
You have to hate Russia.
And the Serbs
Exactly
say, hell no. The Serbs are like,
Oh,
no,
no,
hate Russia. We love Russia.
The Serbs are far more sophisticated and have a much better understanding of what the EU is really about than the Ukrainians do.
I mean, if you go by the EU,
Ukrainians fell for this one hook, line, and sinker.
yeah, exactly.
But you're
I mean,
absolutely, in everything you have just said, you are completely correct.
I mean,
Let me
Moldova
just
and
say-
Ukraine.
I remember the Euromaidan coup. And when it happened, I remember thinking to myself at the time, and Ukraine is fucked. Way back then, I had a big argument with my sister was, let's say, covering the Euromaidan coup as a journalist. And she was positive about it. I was like, now Ukraine is completely fucked. And look where Ukraine is now. And look where Ukraine will be a year from now. It'll be even worse. Oh my God. I don't think any country that I can think of, has been fucked as hard as Ukraine has by its EU and US masters.
Entering the EU, really? I mean,
Really?
even if we were having this discussion 10 years ago, and I were to tell you,
No.
yeah, what do you think about Ukraine and Moldova entering the EU? You would probably laugh. Probably, come on, this is ridiculous. It's not going to happen for 30, 40 years. I mean, there are countries in the EU which really shouldn't be in the EU when you think about it, right?
Exactly.
They messed around with the books in order to enter the EU, and it's caused all kinds of problems, hasn't it? Absolutely. Anyway, so Ukraine got duped the Ukrainian people got duped with the promise of entering the EU, and the globalist political class, they got what they wanted, which is a conflict with Russia.
Yep.
which they want to sustain and prolong.
That was my
That's-
question. So
That's
They want to sustain and prolong because it's about bringing down, balkanizing Russia, basically breaking Russia apart, just like they want to do in Iran. It hasn't achieved its goal, so they want to keep the pressure, because that's the way the globalist U.S. hegemony in the world works. Is like, look at what happened in Syria. There was the civil war in Syria, and they funded ISIS. CIA, Mossad, and it failed ultimately at first. But then 10 years later, 10 years after the civil war started in Syria, finally, after continuous pressure behind the scenes, the Syrian regime eventually collapsed. That's what they're hoping for. We keep on pressure on Russia long enough, maybe Russia will collapse. But Russia is in Syria. It's not going to work. Same with Iran.
That's all that
Yeah.
there.
So how do they
that's
do
all
that?
there is now.
how do they continue to dupe the people and the leadership into believing that there's a pathway to the European Union, while keeping them motivated and committed to destroying themselves
Yes.
on behalf of the globalist political class in Europe? And of course, all of this is being done because there is the thought that by 2030, plus or minus, if Ukraine continues to fight Russia, Russia will be significantly weakened. It will make it a lot easier for the collective West and for NATO to just kind of stroll right into Russia and take it over.
Well, indeed. Well, how do they continue? How do they keep this thing going? Well, I can say straightforwardly, by continuing to do that which they have done to the Ukrainians since, well before 2013, 2014, by continuing to lie to them, to tell them, yes, we do absolutely want you in the EU. You have to just do a few things here and a few things there. And obviously you have to win the war with the Russians first. And we're all behind you on that. We need to get what King Charles, our British king, said to the US Congress, a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, which means, in other words, a Ukrainian victory. You have to go out there and fight and die, because when you do, then you've got this promise. We absolutely assure you that you will get EU membership then. Now, I think that Metz has no intention of getting the Ukraine into the EU. He doesn't want to pay the checks for Ukraine indefinitely. He wants to write checks, lots of checks, but not for Ukraine, ultimately. It's ultimately for, people closer to himself, if I could say that. So I'm coming around to the view that Ukraine is never going to join the EU. Actually.
I agree.
But it will always...
Doubly so now that EU is becoming a military alliance. And Russia said it will never allow Ukraine to join a military alliance and put missiles on its borders. So now, before the Russian position was, okay, it's okay for Ukraine to join the EU, but not NATO. Now the Russia's position is it's not okay for Ukraine to join the EU. So even if EU was willing to let them in, Russia wouldn't allow it.
Be dangled in front of it. And there will always be, and this is the ultimate tragedy, there will always be a very vocal constituency in Kiev, especially, who will, basically from the NGOs, who will go on demanding that the fight against Russia be prolonged, be intensified, because the ultimate reward, which is EU membership, remains there. So I'm afraid the deception is going to continue to work. Now, that's the tragedy of Ukraine. The paradox
It is a tragedy.
is that, of course, there's also now a change in that the Russians, until recently, have always said, look, we don't object to Ukraine joining the EU. Maybe the Russians figured out long ago that the reality was that Ukraine would never join the EU. But at the time of the Istanbul Agreement in 2022, April 2022, 4 years ago, in other words, they said, Ukraine can join the EU. We're even prepared to support its membership in. As we've discussed in recent programs, the Russians now are starting to say, no, this cannot happen. The EU and NATO have merged. Lavrov recently said that it's a single bureaucracy in Brussels, that the NATO and EU bureaucracies are now have now unified. And though they haven't yet made a final statement about this, we are coming close to the point when they will. Now, in a kind of a way, that helps the EU, because they can come to the Ukrainians and say, look, it's not we who are holding back on your aspiration to join us. it's the Russians. So that must mean that you must continue fighting. You must continue to lay down your lives in tens of thousands.
I will point out that there was 8 years between Euromaidan coup and the start of this Ukraine-Russia war. 8 years that in which Ukraine failed to join the EU before the war started even.
Because until you beat the Russians, you can't join. So this hardening of the Russian position may paradoxically have the effect of making this deception that the Europeans are practicing on the Ukrainians easier to practice. Just saying.
No, I agree. I was going to say the same thing, actually. If the Russians come out with a hard statement like the NATO statement and say, look, the NATO, the EU, same thing. The EU is building a military in order to go to war with Russia.
Yeah.
We're not going to stand by and watch Ukraine join the EU. There's no difference between the EU and NATO. If they do say that, then yeah, the EU, they're going to use that against Russia, and they're going to use that in order to convince Ukraine to continue to fight Russia. So what the Russians should do is they should come out and say, you know what,
Thing is, as of like a year ago, 70% of Ukrainians wanted the war to end, want to stop fighting Russia. I guarantee you it's even higher now. You probably 80% of people that don't want to fight Russia anymore. So the only people that this is being dangled in front of are the Ukrainian elites, the ones that aren't on the front lines, not fighting and dying. So I don't know. The Ukrainian people as a whole, I don't think they. I wonder. I don't know how much of them actually believe that they're ever going to join the EU. I would like to see a poll on that.
fully support
Currently,
Ukraine joining the European Union. I'm kind of saying that in a bit of a
absolutely.
joking way, but it's, you know, it could be a strategy. I think the best thing for Russia to do is not to say anything, I guess, when it
Yeah,
comes to
probably.
Ukraine joining the EU. I mean, they have the NATO statement, and they should just leave it at that. And to be honest, even if the Russians did say, if Putin or Medvedev, actually Medvedev has said it,
Yeah.
yes, posted about the EU. I don't think Putin has said anything definitive, but if there was a statement to say, look, no more EU for Ukraine, I don't think anyone would take it seriously anyway. I mean, a warning like that wouldn't be heeded by anybody coming from Putin or Medvedev at this point.
Well, the Europeans still insist that Ukraine is on an irreversible path towards NATO.
yeah,
So I mean, you know, they still reject Russia's red line on NATO.
irreversible path that will take decades, centuries, millennia. It'll happen one day. Sure, really, you're on the path to it. It's beyond the horizon. You know, across Milky Way, in another universe. But eventually, you'll get there.
Membership, they would certainly reject Russia's red line on EU membership. I mean, it's not going to make any difference at all, practically. So probably you're right. Probably the best strategy for the Russians is to say nothing, and there might be a discussion about this. But anyway, there we are. I mean, this is extremely shabby. I mean, shabby is not the right word. I mean, it is hypocrisy and deception and cruelty taken to an almost ultimate level. I mean, there's been nothing like this since the end of the Second World War in Europe, to lure a country, a whole nation, to self-destruct simply so that you can act out some kind of fantasy of weakening Russia is I mean, there is no word I can find or think of.
This war wouldn't have lasted so long if Ukraine hadn't became basically a dictatorship. I mean, they have a secret police killing off and abducting anyone who's critical of the current regime. You have no elections. You basically, and you have forced conscription, people being dragged off the streets to go forcibly fight in the war. That's how this is being waged, this war in Ukraine. An undemocratic regime. Zelensky ran on peace, on the idea that he'd be able to bring peace with Russia, and instead he's doing all this war.
Which can describe properly how bad it is. If anybody wants to have, it has been in any doubt up to now about the kind of people who run the EU, well, I think this should really settle the issue. One day the Ukrainians will...
No, everything you should know about those who run the EU should be clear on how they covered up for decades migrant rapes being far higher than media is willing to report on.
Realize the extent of the deception that has been practiced on them. No, they will. I mean, people do eventually. It will take them a long time. They're nowhere close to that point, but one day they will. And well, it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see how they feel and respond about it. But in the meantime, the war goes on. The fighting continues. It's going despite all the drone attacks on Tuapse and all of these places in Russia.
Another one.
Another one, absolutely.
That's number 4.
Number 4, all of these drone attacks, all of that going on the actual battle lines. In terms of the casualties, Ukraine continues to bleed and die, and I do mean bleed and die. Reports appearing yesterday that the garrison in Konstantinovka now is almost surrounded, and I think that is true. Pictures of emaciated soldiers in the Kupiansk area where they had been surrounded before.
Another
Reports
cauldron.
in Sumy region of that city gradually being encircled by the Russians as well. It's a long, drawn-out destruction of a European nation, but that's how the war will go on. And
It won't even be a nation anymore after all this.
as for all these attacks, these drone attacks on Russia, I've discussed them in many places. In my opinion, they're pinpricks. I've already said, in my opinion, that the reason that Tuapse was not particularly well defended is because
Tuapse is that refinery I talked about before that was recently really badly hit here over 4 days.
I think that there have been American interests involved. Tuapse, the refinery, I should make this clear, the refinery and the port at Tuapse are fully owned by Rosneft, the Russian state monopoly. But Rosneft, the Russian oil export company, which is state-owned, had very close connections before the war, before the Ukraine crisis, with the American oil industry. Tuapse was being used to export oil from Central Asian producers, which means basically Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. I think that a lot of the oil that was going through Tuapse was being labeled, what it really was is another question completely, was being labeled as as coming to these countries. And I think the Americans had a stake in it. And I think for that reason, the air defenses in Tuapse were not particularly strong because the Russians didn't expect that it would ever be attacked. I think that's the story of Tuapse. It's been very embarrassing for the Russian authorities,
Yep.
but it is not going to change the course of the war.
Well, it's embarrassing, and it also points to the fact that, once again, Putin appears to have been
It's also infuriating for the Russian population. That's it puts huge pressure on the government to respond, to attack the countries who are making those drones that are destroying their infrastructure.
duped by the United States or by the West, because he's thinking, if we go by your theory, he's thinking, well, we have a kind of understanding that because this oil refinery is connected to the West or to the United States, they're not going to touch it. In other words, the United States is not going to provide the targeting data to hit this part of the Russian Federation, which that in and of itself is pretty messed up when you think about it. But there you go. The United States says, no, we have no problem providing the targeting data to hit Tuapse to the Ukrainian drones.
Well, indeed. I think one of the things that the Russians have not fully understood, and they're not the only people, by the way, is that within the current administration in Washington and within the American political elite, quite apart from all the geopolitical factors, there is a very, very aggressive, very hard-nosed attitude, which is that you stop all energy exports pretty much by everyone, because that will leave the US alone in the game. So oil from Kazakhstan, oil from Azerbaijan, assuming that it is being exported through Tuapse, which I believe it was.
I don't doubt that there there is a portion of the U.S. deep state or U.S. Trump administration that, yes, disrupt all the oil of everyone else. It makes our oil more expensive and it benefits us, of course.
Well, some American companies, some American business people might have had an interest in it, but ultimately it is competing on global markets with oil that is produced in the United States. So for that reason, you want to stop it, just as you want to stop oil being exported from everywhere else. Now, I'm not saying that this is a universal view within the United States, but I think it is a powerful one. And I think it also has, well, I mean, it's the one that, if you have a block of people who think in that way, you can easily see how they and the neocons and the intelligence agencies.
If you're a U.S. oil executive, Russia oil exports get disrupted. That means you can sell your oil at a higher price. So on that, yes, out of self-interest, there will be people in the United States that will be pushing to hit refineries in Russia.
This could come together and make this kind of combine and hit economic targets in that way. I don't think it's just Putin who doesn't get this, by the way. I mean, bear in mind, Putin is the president of Russia. Whether he actually knows what the air defense situation in a place like Tuapse actually is whether this is something, that he's, whether he comes along and talks to Belarus or wherever it is he talks to and says, have we taken precautions to provide air defenses around Tuapse? I mean, I don't know whether that conversation has ever taken place up to now, but I'm going to make a guess. I think quite plausibly the people who were giving advice to the military to keep air defenses away from Tuapse probably wasn't Putin himself, though inevitably he's going to be blamed for it. My guess is it was Rosneft. Rosneft says, look, we have this relationship, this historic relationship with the Americans. Don't start bringing in your air defenses here, because if you do that, you're going to make us into a target, because that will draw Ukrainian attacks. We don't need you, because we have this long-standing relationship with the Americans.
I don't know if I fully believe this, but it's possible. In any case, the Ukraine managed to inflict more damage to this refinery off the coast of the Black Sea than they did in any other place in Russia. So something was different there.
Talk to them still. I know that they do, by the way. I know that companies like Rosneft have been talking to the Americans. And I also know that the Kremlin has actually given warnings to Russian companies not to stop doing that, but to be very, very careful about engaging in these sort of contacts and not to try to engage in any sort of diplomacy without the Kremlin's position. But, Rosneft, I can see how they might have said to the Russian military, we don't want you here. Stay away. This place is not going to be attacked. If you start coming here, you bring us into the war, and we don't want to be there. And Rosneft might not have
If that's true, some executives are getting fired.
understood that they're talking to the wrong Americans.
Attacked 4 times in 1 week.
Well, there you go.
Yes,
Well,
yes, it's 4 times. It was 1, 2, 3, 4, and after the 3rd time, you had an Italian drone flying off the coast to do reconnaissance, and then they hit them again.
It's absurd.
Well,
It's absurd.
now it's different. Now there will be a change, and there will be those arrangements.
But
now.
is there anything left to protect?
But again, knowing Russia, and I have to say this, knowing Russia, I suspect that this is what has been happening there. It makes more sense to me than the assumption that Putin was discussing with Trump or whoever, and telling the military, don't worry about Tuapse. I have this understanding with Trump. You see, this is I think something people do need to understand. Putin is not in control of everything in Russia. Joseph Stalin, it would have been completely different, by the way. If it had been Joseph Stalin, absolutely, he would have insisted, I want everything defended, and if you didn't defend it, well, you'd be off to Siberia or worse. I mean, that is the way the Soviet Union in the 1940s worked. But today's Russia is a very different place.
Well, you can make the same argument for President Trump as well, or for any leader. That, they can't control everything. But the fact of the matter is that they are the leader, they are the president or the prime minister of a country. And when a debacle like this occurs, they absolutely should get the blame, because they're sitting in the chair. 1 time, okay, 2 times, okay, but 4 times in the last week, it shows a level of incompetence. There's something wrong. Without a doubt, there is something wrong, and Putin better get on top of it. That would be my thinking. If I was in Putin's chair, I would be saying, I better get on top of this and figure out what the hell is going on. And I just have a sense that the leadership in the Kremlin should start to make a decision. If do they want to win this war, or do they want to try and please all sides? We have to be good with Trump. We have to be good with the oil oligarchs. We have to be good with these people in BRICS and China.
Yep.
And also, let's not forget about keeping the door open for our European partners. Maybe in the future, they're going to come around and come to their senses again. There's a sense of indecisiveness. And this is just my opinion, my sense of things. I still feel like there's, looking at the situation from afar, and I am afar, I'm very far away. So, keep that in mind. But there's an indecisiveness there after 4 years of this. There still appears to be an indecisiveness. And you have a saying. I mean, you said in the past before that, you can't serve, or if you try to please everybody.
Everybody, you please do your please.
That's the sense that I'm getting still of this Kremlin administration.
Yes. Well, I think the first thing to say is, on the front lines, there's no sign of any indecision. I mean, there, as I said, it is a remorseless lava flow that just keeps flowing and doesn't look like it's going to stop. And in terms of negotiations, I mean, first of all, there aren't any. I mean, I think that's an important thing to say. And as I've discussed many times, if you go back to Putin's
thing is, what he's suggesting is escalation. Like, not pleasing all, just places where factories are these drones that hit the refinery, places where they're being manufactured in like Italy, Germany, France. Just bomb them. He does. Yeah. Why are you trying to? They're basically at war with you anyway. Don't worry about Article 5.
Various statements. I mean, he's never given an inch that we know about. I mean, the June 14th, 2024 Istanbul Plus demands have never been watered down. There is this mystery as to what was actually agreed in Anchorage. But my sense about Anchorage increasingly is that Anchorage was a case of the Americans making concessions, not the Russians. And maybe the Russians did agree some kind of scheduling issues. In other words, the Ukrainians would first withdraw from Donbass, and then there'd be a pause, and then they would withdraw from Zaporozhye and Kherson or something of that kind. But it doesn't seem to me, from everything I've seen, that they negotiated anything substantive. Now, in all other respects, well, firstly, you're absolutely right. Putin is the president. The buck has to and does ultimately always stop with him. If something goes wrong in a place like Tuapse, inevitably, it is he who is going to be criticized, because irrespective of who made the decisions and who acted
Somebody need to roll somewhere for that.
in any particular way, he must take the responsibility because he stands for the entire leadership of Russia. I mean, that is the nature of politics. Any political leader who has any seriousness about them understands that. I think that at this particular moment in time, there is going to be, there will probably almost certainly already is, a lot of anger and recrimination and discussions within the leadership about the situation at Tuapse. At the same time as Putin was talking to Trump the other day, Medvedev was issuing a ferocious message of his statement of his own, in which he made perfectly clear that he thought the Americans were the enemy and all of that. So I think that kind of discussion does take place. But in terms of indecision, I think, again, it's something people have to understand. It's a Putin. It is keeping this entire huge country moving steadily in that kind of direction. Putin cannot simply ignore the oil oligarchs. He cannot simply ignore the BRICS. He has to keep all of these constituencies at least sort of feeling that he is listening to them and is paying attention to what they do, because he needs to keep everybody moving in the same direction. Now, if you're looking at Russian history, another example of this is a Russian ruler with whom Putin, by the way, identifies, and he's discussed this many times, who was Tsar Alexander, the Tsar who defeated Napoleon. He too was relentlessly criticized for being weak, for being indecisive, for failing to make strong positions. He had tensions within his family. His sister was furious with him because he was agreeing to meet and talk to Napoleon at all. But eventually he got to Paris. That's, I think, what we need to keep in mind. You could argue the same about Abraham Lincoln. If anybody who studied the American Civil War will know that Lincoln went through exactly the same process as the one Putin is going through, and encountered exactly the same criticisms. He also, in the end, won. Ultimately, when this war is concluded and the Russians have won, all of these things will fade into the background. That's my view.
Yeah,
Maybe.
We'll see what the timeline brings us, and we'll end it on this point.
All right, that was a really interesting video. And this will be in YouTube. Like and subscribe. Come watch on Kick or Twitch. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye.